Wyneken is in no small part, I would rather say in actually a very large part, responsible for Lutheranism being what it is today in the United States.
Understanding a person who was born over 200 years ago requires some degree of familiarity with the context of his times. The religious scene in Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries had been dominated by rationalism in the universities. There, professors dissected the Bible using methods that denied the supernatural. German institutions, above all others, were at the forefront of this higher critical method. Still, there were pietist Lutherans who sought more than anything else to live a pure and godly life, and generally were suspicious of their scholarly pastors. However, pietists' focus often overemphasized the doctrine of sanctification above the doctrine of justification. A new movement arose from another source. Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia wished to solidify and centralize his government in his enlarged kingdom. He first strongly encouraged, and then later enforced, a union in liturgy, organization, and practice with his Reformed and Lutheran churches in Prussia. The Confessional Lutheran movement arose in response. It pursued a return to the true biblical doctrine and practice as described in the Book of Concord. Meanwhile, the Lutheran population in the United States was growing through immigration. However, Lutheran synods there were small and ineffective, and often unable to organize outreach ministry to immigrants. Unconnected settlers frequently found themselves isolated from the Lutheran Church and repeatedly succumbed to pressures to assimilate at the price of their religious identity. Within this setting, this presentation of my research will illuminate the context, practical constraints, and limited mental horizons Friedrich Conrad Dietrich Wyneken experienced as he underwent a theological and deeply personal transformation. Wyneken realized his distinct Lutheran identity when he encountered Methodism on the American frontier, his confessional voice when he clashed with Unionists and Pietists in Germany, and his aptitude for leadership when he exposed American Lutheranism in the United States. On May 22, 1810, Pastor Heinrich Christoph Wyneken recorded the baptism of his sixth son, Friedrich Conrad Dietrich Wyneken, in the congregational records of St. Andreas Church in Verden, Germany. Wyneken's childhood was not without severe challenges. His father died when he was only 5, and he would later write, "From the time I was a young man, as far back as I can remember, into my earliest childhood, I suffered horribly from melancholy and hypochondria." Wyneken's early religious training was heavily influenced by his grandmother. Whenever their rationalist pastor was brought up in conversation, their grandmother would repeat, "The more learned, the more perverted." This pastor brought younger people to tears with his eloquence, but older members shook their heads. Every Sunday, grandmother directed Fritz and his older siblings to look at the Bible and say, "There, see for yourself. Here, it is completely different." She would next turn to Luther's Catechism and Johann Arndt's Wahres Christentum. Wyneken's grandmother encouraged her grandson, "Stay with the dear Lord Jesus Christ for me, and do not let yourself be turned away from the Catechism and the hymns." Following his grandmother's instructions was not without difficulty or pain. Elementary religious instruction in Germany had been subverted by rationalism, as 19th century economist and traveler Thomas Hodgkins noted. What is taught the children under the term religion is very general morality. Wyneken recalled his experience in this system. When the schoolmaster wanted to make a learned person out of me, and wanted to teach me all kinds of muddled stuff, I could not and did not want to learn anything. The schoolmaster was nasty. He took his rod and said, "A priori will not work with Fritz. I must try a posteriori." What that was supposed to mean, I could not say, but I could feel it very well, because then followed rather hard blows on my back, and I was always called Dumb Fritz. Thinking of his grandmother, young Wyneken never gave in to his rationalist teacher or to peer pressure. He later boasted, "They could not take the catechism and hymns from my head and heart." In his late teens, Wyneken went to the University of Göttingen, a center of the development of the higher critical method. Wyneken only attended Göttingen for a semester. He left out of disgust with the strict atmosphere and students' vulgar behavior. In 1830, Wyneken went to Halle, which was supposedly more religious. Yet other prominent rationalist scholars like Wilhelm Gesenius and Julius August Ludwig Wegscheider thrived at this institution as they instructed Wyneken. Although prominent and recognized today, these professors did not have as much of an influence on Wyneken, the awakened August Tulloch. After his education, Wyneken became the rector of the Latin school in Bremervorde. There, he also helped establish the local temperance society, but Wyneken also showed interest in world missions. He made contacts with the leaders in mission work and became involved in the North German Mission Society. In 1838, after years of waiting for a pastorship in vain, Wyneken decided to go to the United States. Wyneken's motivation for doing mission work was not ideal, as he later confessed. Regrettably, I must admit that neither love for the Lord nor for the orphan brothers have induced me to go to America, nor natural inclination. On the contrary, I went there with reluctance and great struggle, out of duty, compelled by my conscience. On June 28, 1838, Wyneken arrived in Baltimore on the Apollo and began asking around for Lutherans. Coming from a country where almost everyone he knew was a Lutheran, at least in name, this proved to be harder than he expected. However, Wyneken soon realized his distinct Lutheran identity. After he was tricked into attending a German Methodist revival service, he reportedly exclaimed, "I don't know whether it is from God or from the devil. It is certainly not Lutheran." Eventually, Wyneken was taken in by a Lutheran pastor, Johann Heesbert, who served a congregation in Baltimore. After 6 weeks, Heesbert arranged for Wyneken to finally receive official instructions and a call from the Pennsylvania Ministerium to serve German immigrants in northern Indiana and southern Michigan. In Pittsburgh, while underway to his destination, Wyneken befriended Friedrich Schmidt, the editor of the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. This was one of the most important contacts Wyneken made in his early years in America. Through Schmidt, Wyneken had a voice both to share his experiences and make public appeals for aid for his mission work. In one letter, Wyneken reported that his workload was unrealistically large. He served 2 congregations regularly and 5 preaching stations in a 30 to 40 mile circumference. Other mission trips took him even farther. Wyneken was stretched too thin, and he said he could not adequately serve more than 2 congregations at a time. A widespread obstacle to ministry in the frontier was the terrible education system. Frontier immigrant children had fallen behind in religious instruction. Wyneken firmly believed he needed to have more time for instruction if the frontier church was going to survive. He saw souls at the point of death. When Wyneken appealed to the Pennsylvania Synod, the Synod's Mission Society gave Wyneken their full endorsement and support. Yet ultimately, they were impotent in their ability to serve his needs, saying, "We were concerned that his desire might be fulfilled, but on account of the great want of ministers, this has not occurred." Placed in an impossible situation, Wyneken began to use methods practiced by his predecessor, the recently deceased Lutheran pastor and missionary Jesse Hoover. Pastor Hoover had supplemented his meager income through the American Home Mission Society, an organization founded in 1826 to serve the needs of any Protestant congregation or pastor in a mission field. They fully embraced and encouraged social reform through temperance societies and kept track of how many revivals were held at each location and counted how many conversions a pastor made in a year. Wyneken realized that he could not faithfully serve his congregations in Fort Wayne and Friedheim, Indiana, while at the same time performing his missionary call from the Pennsylvania Synod. He requested, and was granted, release from his missionary duties. However, this meant that his funding from the Pennsylvania Synod was cut off. Either out of indifference to denominational affiliation or bowing to pragmatism, Wyneken obtained a commission for the American Home Mission Society for 1 full year. Wyneken inherited another significant connection from the deceased Hoover in the form of the small frontier church body, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the West. Synod President William Jenkins assumed that it was the Synod's duty to fill a position vacated by Hoover. To assist the congregations while a replacement was still being found, Pastor John Jacob Lemanowski a Pole who had once been a colonel in Napoleon Bonaparte's cavalry, traveled to Fort Wayne in December of 1838. He was very much surprised to find that Wyneken had already been sent there by the Pennsylvania Synod. Wyneken was out on a circuit when Lemanowski stopped by in Fort Wayne, but without much investigation, he promptly wrote to Lemanowski seeking membership in the Synod of the West. With the addition of Wyneken, the Synod of the West could boast a roster of 17 pastors and 2 candidates for ministry. The Synod's minutes were recorded in English, which was the preferential language of the pastors. The Synod of the West had congregations which were spread across areas of Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Missouri. However, historian John B. Gardner described the Synod of the West as more Methodist than Lutheran. Indeed, if Wyneken had attended the Synod's annual session in 1839, he may have been shocked at what these Lutherans were doing. One evening, the attendees gathered to commence a revival. This religious practice, at which Wyneken had recoiled at in Baltimore, was described in the session's minutes in detail. This discourse produced a very deep feeling in the congregation. Silence reigned through the house, save the voice of the speaker, and here and there a half-suppressed sigh or groan, which burst involuntarily forth from the heaving breasts of deeply convicted sinners. The whole congregation became more or less moved. The place became truly awful and glorious. This episode illustrates how many American Lutherans had adopted the quote-unquote new measures and an American approach to religion. In February 1841, Wyneken wrote a letter to his mother in which he described his ongoing discussions with his brother, Pastor Carl Wyneken, and encouraged him in his ecclesiastical struggles in Hanover, saying, "Let him leave off a little church history and go through the Bible and our Lutheran doctrines and come over in God's name." Here, Wyneken was taking the lead in pointing his own older brother back to the Scriptures and Lutheran doctrine. Yet Wyneken also described his own spiritual struggles and self-doubt. "Sometimes I can't possibly understand why God has made me, a poor worm, the preacher here, and why long ago he hasn't sent another to my place." As an awakened Christian, Wyneken learned to focus on his own spiritual failings. As a result, he suffered from a troubled conscience and anxiety over his own adequacy for mission work. Yet Wyneken was not the only immigrant missionary who had struggled with self-doubt. Wilhelm Nast, 3 years Wyneken's senior, had much in common with the Lutheran circuit writer. Nast had a Lutheran upbringing and even some seminary training, yet his troubled soul found no comfort in rationalism, and like Wyneken, Nast found spiritual sensitivity among the Pietists. However, when Nast came to the United States, he was entranced by the emotional spiritual experiences offered by Methodist revivals, and he became one of their number. Soon, he became a Methodist missionary to German immigrants. Nast employed a strategy which resulted in scores of Protestant German immigrants joining the Methodist Church. According to historian W. Harrison Daniel, Nast possessed a strong self-awareness concerning Methodism's similarities and differences with Lutheranism. Nast was at great pains to encourage all German-speaking preachers to focus entirely on the mercy and saving grace of God in Christ. Nast's strategy worked. Soon, Wyneken saw many of his own members leave the church of their birth. In response, Wyneken preached a sermon concerning unity, which was later published in the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. Wyneken wanted his congregations to see why a Christian should stay in his or her own church. If in his fellowship a man is not forced to do or leave undone something that is contrary to the Holy Scriptures, it is his unavoidable duty to remain in that fellowship. Wyneken's focus on fellowship was not about encouraging Christians to leave heterodox congregations, but on keeping Lutherans in Lutheran congregations. Wyneken commented on a key point of doctrinal contention between Lutherans and Methodists. Can such a person advance in sanctification, which God works, when he goes off on his own way and pursues a sanctification he thinks up himself? When you leave and seek another fellowship, you do it apparently for its arrangements and institutions, and not for the sake of having Christ, whom you already have. And thus you seek your goal not in Christ alone and his grace, but in external things. 2 months later, Wyneken sent another open letter to the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. This letter was not his typical report of the hardships he faced on the frontier. It was a polemical letter, written in response to statements made by Nast in the Kirchliche Apologete. What a pity that Satan succeeded to exhale his destructive miasma over the new life in the awakened church in order to destroy it. Wyneken's conflict with the Methodists went a long way in developing his doctrinal practices. Some in America began calling him an old Lutheran, but that was the least of his concerns. In late 1841, after years of minimal responses to written appeals addressed to German mission societies, Wyneken decided to return to Germany and issue a call for help for the Lutheran Church in America in person. Wyneken's primary goal was to gain men and materials for frontier mission work. To achieve these aims, Wyneken met with a cornucopia of Lutheran leaders in mission work. While these men were all evangelical, they represented many different shades of doctrinal positions. In Berlin, Wyneken met with Orthodox Lutheran Ernst Wilhelm Hengstenberg, editor of the Evangelische Kirchenzeitung. In Erlangen, Wyneken met with Karl von Raumer. In Breslau, he made the acquaintance of Georg Philipp Eduard Huschke, leader of the Old Lutherans and president of the Oberkirchenkollegium. In Saxony, he conferred with Hebrew scholar Franz Delitzsch. In Bremen, Wyneken met with leaders in missions, such as Reformed minister Georg Treviranus and Johann Heinrich Wichern. Seeking to prompt Lutherans in Germany into action, Wyneken wryly observed, "I know well that Christianity must come from the inside, but I also know that the word must come first from the outside into us. We are not bold enough in Germany, and will not soon be smarter until the Methodists show you how it's done. Then, it's too late." Soon Wyneken realized that putting his plea into writing could supplement his personal exhortations. By early 1843, Wyneken had written Der Not der Deutschen Lutheraner in Nordamerika. It has commonly been called the Notruf, meaning distress call. Wyneken made special mention of the Methodists and their revivals in his Notruf to demonstrate to German Lutherans how truly awful the conditions were on the American frontier, where their relatives were at the mercy of the sects if no Lutheran pastors were there to guide them. There is hardly a Lutheran or Reformed congregation which does not have to suffer from these swarming pests. Many congregations have been completely scattered by them, others are constantly exposed to their attacks and banter, and complaints about these agitators come from all areas. For the faithful preacher, they are a constant evil, going at the very marrow of his soul. Wyneken's purpose in describing revivals was to provoke a response of horror among his readers. To them, this practice was both foreign and terrifying. Wyneken believed it to be demonic. Friedrich Lochner was so moved by Wyneken's presentation at a public gathering in Nuremberg that he decided to answer the distress call for workers. Wyneken's depiction of a Methodist revival made a lasting impression. Lochner later recalled, "Wyneken suddenly came up to those sitting or standing closest or close to him, seized some by the hand and asked them, 'Don't you want to be converted too?' I can see how some looked at the speaker, startled. Some even shrank back shyly, as though they feared that a Methodist conversion was to take place in earnest." While the Methodists later sought to discredit Wyneken, he replied, "What I have written about them I can answer for as the truth on the last day." Wyneken did not only write about the threat of Methodism in the Notruf. His comments on the contemporary state of Lutheranism in America further indicates from whence Wyneken's confessionalism came. What Wyneken had witnessed in America had already pushed him to align himself with confessional Lutheranism before direct contact with the confessional camp in Germany. Wyneken described the doctrine of English-speaking Lutherans. They have completely broken away from the faith of their fathers. While they are enthusiastic about the name Lutheran, they attack the teachings of our church and spread their false doctrines. In addition, they are strong defenders of new measures and are quite Methodistic in their approach to conversion. Wyneken further noted that unionism was quickly taking root in the United States, a grave threat to the future development of the Lutheran Church in America. The solid ground of doctrine is completely deserted in exchange for the slippery ground of subjectivity. Indifference and laxity in matters of doctrine are the result. In this way, people become accustomed to thinking so little of sanctity of fellowship that they finally change fellowship in the way they change clothes. Having become more aware of his Lutheran identity through clashes with Methodists, Wyneken had recognized many similarities with the un-Lutheran doctrines and practices within the English-speaking Lutheran Church in America, and brought them to the attention of his confessional audience. However, Wyneken did not attack English-speaking Lutheranism to curry favor with potential confessional supporters in Germany. Rather, Wyneken was already very mature in his understanding of Lutheran doctrine. Wyneken was not retrospectively bothered by doctrinal laxity in the United States, but he had been propelled by it, in part, to issue his call for help. Wyneken's stand for genuine Lutheran doctrine cost him potential allies. Initially, Wyneken and Wyneken got along well, but later parted over Wyneken's allegiance with the ultra-Lutherans. It was Wyneken's bond with confessional pastor Wilhelm Leah and his mission society at Neuendettelsau which produced the greatest materialization in reply to Wyneken's call. Wyneken gave Leah focus for his mission society. Leah would train missionaries and then send them to the American wilderness. Wyneken's notruf was finally answered by Leah's Zuruf aus der Heimat an die Deutsch-Lutherische Kirche. This document, with over 900 signatures from 38 kingdoms, provinces, duchies, principalities, and free cities within the German Confederation, presented a confessional German church united behind the North American mission. In May 1843, Leah praised and thanked Wyneken in Kirchliche Mitteilungen. Wyneken especially is the one whose faithful, fiery words and letters and appeals awakened our sleeping love of the forsaken North Americans and has shaken us out of the sinful forgetfulness to our precious duty. He, this upright, eloquent disciple of the Lord, has become a treasure to us. In the last words written on his notruf mission, Wyneken reflected upon his time in Germany and the new challenges waiting for him in America. It is a difficult step, I will not deny it, not only outwardly, but also in view of the spiritual life and activities and their battles, which often make me shudder when I think that I must re-engage them. My hope is on the Lord, who has been my strength and energy, and has kept me, a poor, weak creature, active. The battle is all the more difficult since the recent eruption of spiritual life, here in our area of northern Germany, with the Reformed and Lutherans, so that we must oppose those with whom we once felt united. Ha! Those were bitter hours, but not without blessing. Wyneken had a mixture of influences and goals. He had a pietist upbringing and awakened mentoring. He had a deep evangelical spirit seeking to serve the lost and straying. He could have been drawn into Methodism by their emotional displays of repentance and faith. He could have prioritized ecumenical cooperation over doctrinal purity, and taken the path offered by many mission societies and the General Synod. But the justification-focused Wyneken gravitated toward the scriptural and doctrinal truth espoused by confessional Lutherans. In Germany, he publicly and completely aligned himself with the confessional movement. In July 1843, Wyneken returned to Fort Wayne and wasted no time in implementing his confessionalism. He completely purged the Reformed and Methodist elements from his congregation. Affirmation of the Augsburg Confession was a prerequisite for membership. This subscription to the Augsburg Confession was not required by the Synod of the West. For several years, Wyneken remained in the Synod, even though the leadership of the Synod wanted nothing to do with the renaissance of confessional Lutheranism. Leah later shared Wyneken's reasons for remaining in this Synod. Pastor Wyneken had long known that he could not endure in the Synod of the West for long, but he did not want to leave it quickly, so that through faithful testimony he might save many. In 1844, the Synod of the West met at Wyneken's congregation in Fort Wayne. Wyneken was accompanied by his own congregation's leaders and a few fellow-minded pastors, such as Adam Ernst, one of Leah's first commissioned missionaries. When most of the convention voted for establishing a college with the Synod of Ohio, Wyneken and his allies presented a written formal protest saying, "The Church of Christ must have, has had, and shall have always the same doctrines. The unaltered Augsburg Confession of Faith is the unalterable ground of the doctrine of the Church of Christ. No union in matters of the Church can possibly agree with the will of God when it is not based upon the ground of unity of faith. The doctrines of our Church are not sufficiently guaranteed to us in the proposed Constitution submitted to this Synod by the Synod of Ohio." The majority considered the minority protest uncalled for and erroneous. Ecumenical cooperation had been the predominant attitude in the Synod of the West. The sudden appearance of confessional principles were perceived as mean-spirited scruples. Writing to Leah, Ernst reported that he had witnessed how faithfully and forcefully Wyneken represented the truth. As relations cooled with one body of Lutherans, Wyneken sought an opportunity to start a synod of like-minded confessional Lutherans. Wyneken had once been a lone voice in the wilderness, but after his return to Indiana, he found that he was not alone. Wyneken first read Walther's Der Lutheraner in late 1844 or early 1845. It seems as if Walther and Wyneken learned of each other almost simultaneously. In one of the earliest editions, Walther responded to the note-roof in Der Lutheraner. In it, he gave full recommendation to the pamphlet and praised the striking and deep analysis of the Methodists. Through Der Lutheraner, a conversation was started between the Saxons and Walther on one end, and by Wyneken and the men he inspired to serve as pastors and missionaries in Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, on the other. The formerly isolated Wyneken now had others who shared his beliefs and background. Together, they developed a vision and a plan for a confessional German Lutheran Church in the United States. In late 1844, Wyneken received a call from the Second German Lutheran Church in Baltimore, where he had briefly served when he first arrived in the United States. In his acknowledgement letter to the congregation, Wyneken listed conditions he required before accepting the call. He insisted that, "I have the freedom to use a genuine Old Lutheran agenda, particularly for the use of baptism and the Lord's Supper." Although the congregation insisted that they were a true Lutheran congregation, Wyneken soon discovered union practices, especially in the preparations for the Lord's Supper. The members were truly shocked to hear that they did not have Wyneken's full approval. Though they thought they were good Lutherans, congregation member Alexander Einwächter recalled how Wyneken went about reform. He now brought the congregation to a better understanding of pure evangelical Lutheran teachings, but not without some difficulty. Until that time, we were a mixed congregation of Lutherans and Reformed. Since the Reformed found fault with the teachings on Holy Communion, they went away, except for a few who recognized the truth and remained. By comparing the Lutheran and Heidelberg catechisms side by side from the pulpit, Wyneken demonstrated that it was impossible for Lutherans and Reformed to coexist without doctrinal compromise. Still a member of the Synod of the West in May 1845, Wyneken took the opportunity to attend the 13th General Synod Convention in Philadelphia. Before Wyneken arrived, the convention had resolved to write to church leaders in Europe to, quote, counter the false representations of their doctrine and practice that had been circulated in Germany. Members of the General Synod had read Wyneken's note-roof and believed that it gave a false description of the position of the Lutheran Church. Taking advantage of this accusation, Wyneken challenged the General Synod to send more than just letters. He demanded that they send copies of Samuel Simon Schmucker's Popular Theology, Fraternal Appeal, and Portraiture of Lutheranism, as well as Benjamin Kurtz's Infant Baptism and Effusion and Why Are You a Lutheran?, and other documents as representatives of the General Synod's theology. To Rudelbach, Arles, and, quote, other distinguished editors of Lutheran magazines in Germany for their judgments as to whether the accusations made to them are false or not. Wyneken's alternative was that they renounce the un-Lutheran doctrines and practices in them. Wyneken's proposals were disdainfully rejected. The General Synod would send letters to Germany without qualifying their version of Lutheranism. Knowing what the General Synod was attempting to conceal, Wyneken sent a public warning to his confessional brothers in Germany. Published by Leah, Wyneken wanted to make the General Synod's doctrinal position abundantly clear, saying she has laid bare her apostasy in doctrine and practice by the consensus of her members, as well as in the books and magazines which proceed under her protection. Wyneken's break with the General Synod was official. In his book Lutherans in Crisis, historian David Gustafson comments on Wyneken's stand at the General Synod Convention, saying, "At Philadelphia, Wyneken was virtually a lone voice, but his words were a portent of what was to come. Wyneken's protest was the first confessional voice heard aloud." In December 1847, Wyneken's congregation voted to join the Missouri Synod, which had been organized earlier that year. Wyneken's efforts and hard work had paid off. In 1848, he traveled to St. Louis and officially joined the Missouri Synod. In 1850, Wyneken accepted a call to serve Trinity Lutheran Church in St. Louis, and shortly thereafter was elected to the office of Synod President. Wyneken's formative years in his early ministry on the frontier had significant importance as Wyneken became a central figure in Lutheranism in America as the Missouri Synod President. During his administration, Wyneken would lead and guide the Synod through some of its critical years of growth and controversy. He left it united and firmly rooted upon the doctrine of justification, the proper use of law and gospel, and the solas of the Lutheran confessions. Having emerged from the chaos of frontier mission work, Wyneken's confessional development, transformation, and application in the 1840s made him the preeminent choice for Lutheran leadership in the 1850s and beyond.